Hello, everyone. There's a traditional interpretation of this week's parasha, Chayyei, that sees it as a justification for return to the land, not only for the generations of the Torah, but for generations of Jews throughout human history. And despite the fact that this interpretation has had very damaging and even murderous consequences, it's one that people still adhere to, despite the other very powerful emotional and spiritual dimensions of the story. And this week I'm guided in my thoughts by Maeera Shreiber, professor at the University of Utah, whose commentary on Chayyei I found in the Women's Torah Commentary published by the Union of Reformed Judaism. And to turn to the story for a moment, what we're introduced to at the beginning is the death of Sarah and Abraham's mourning for her. And after Abraham mourns Sarah, he has to acquire a burial plot for her. And so he turns to the Hittites and Ephron, the landowner, before whom Abraham professes that he is indeed a stranger in a strange land. And so Ephron tries to offer him the burial plot for free, but Abraham desists and insists instead on paying the full price so he can establish unequivocally his title and the title of future generations to that piece of land. Now, what Maeera Shreiber points out here is something that I completely overlooked after so many times studying the story, which is that the province of public mourning in the Bible and rabbinic literature, in Hebrew poetry, is generally assigned to women. And so it's unusual that we would see Abraham in such a visible public mourning for Sarah. And in particular, Maeera Shreiber points out how the Book of Lamentations has as its core an image of a personified Jerusalem as a widow who's abandoned and who's scorned and who is subject to some of the most graphic imagery in the entire Hebrew Bible. But something happened for me this year in my own study of Lamentations, which I did over the course of several weeks with our Tuesday Bible study group in anticipation of Tisha B'Av, and we read the Book of Lamentations. And that was, I noticed that as we went through the book, especially in its dark chapters, which are filled with deep and bitter expressions of pain, that in addition to being an outlet for the pain of those reflecting on the destruction of Jerusalem, that the lamentation was also a form of protest. There are these lines that get repeated, especially in those first 2 or 3 chapters, when the narrator, again, thinking in the consciousness of Jerusalem as a widow who's been abandoned and berated and abused, calls out to God, "Look at what you've done and see." The implication being that the divine punishment visited upon the city was too much, that it was too cruel, and it was unjust. And so what happens in the book, very interestingly, after this not only expression of pain, but also protest, is that the narrator asks its readers to go inward and look, and to see how we can act differently in the world. And then famously, the book ends on a note of demanding from God, after all of this protest and after taking on the willingness to look inward, the narrator of the Book of Lamentations demands from God help in seeking the moral and spiritual renewal that's really at the heart of the book's yearnings. And so there's a question then, ultimately, if according to Maeera Shreiber, the whole gesture and ritual of lamentation is usually expressed by women, why is it that Abraham is lamenting? So I don't really know, but underlying this story and all the stories, I think, in Genesis are unresolved questions about power. So who has power? Is it the great warlords that existed at that time in those stories? Is it the temporal rulers, people who are situated in their land and rule over it? Or is it this unique family of wanderers who follow their flocks from place to place? Do men have power, or do women have power? Is it people who are on the ins or people who are on the outs? People who have wealth or people who don't? And these questions are never fully resolved in Genesis. And so with this image of Abraham wailing, we have a different mode of what it means to live in the world. That instead of being someone who up until this point has really accumulated a lot of wealth and status in the world, we have the image of someone mourning, which means someone who's showing his own vulnerability and his longing. And so we see here, through Avraham's mourning, a set of universal yearnings for justice, for companionship, for healing. And in the attributes that get expressed, we see a very different set of attributes than those that are associated with power and domination. We see humility, and we see longing, and we see a willingness to see oneself as alone in the world, which means he would have to see himself as inherently connected to other people in this world. And so ultimately, I think there's a powerful switch, a powerful pivot in the story from the image of Abraham as the ideal and the focus of our aspirations, as someone who goes through this world amassing power and wealth and outsmarting the various rulers around him to survive and prosper, to a model that's very different, a model that sees him as connected to his own pain, and by extension of that, to the pain of the world. And through that, the aspiration to live as someone who, through connecting to that pain, becomes an agent for healing and for justice and wholeness, not only for himself, but for the nations of the world as well. So with that, I wish you a Shabbat Shalom. I hope we can all be agents for healing and justice in the times ahead. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. Take care.